Nicotine causes an antidepressant effect, but the antagonists of cholinergic receptors also cause an antidepressant effect. Is this contradictory? Not necessarily. Hello friends, welcome to another segment of my series on the cholinergic system in the brain. Be sure to check out the link below to get to the blog post that's related to this video so that you can follow the detailed discussion in my longer literature review on the cholinergic system, which is extremely well cited and a great jumping off point if you really want to dig deep into the cholinergic system. But for now, what we're going to discuss in this video are two mental disease states that are very much affected by the cholinergic system in the brain. Specifically, I want to tell you first briefly about Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is characterized by a loss of cholinergic neurons in the basal forebrain. In fact, although doctors cannot treat the actual disease, they do treat the symptoms of the disease of Alzheimer's disease. And the main way they treat the symptoms is through acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. You'll recall from the last episode that acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in the brain into acetate and choline. It cleaves the acetyl group from the acetylcholine. The more of the enzyme you have in the brain, the less acetylcholine you have in the brain. So what these drugs do is they inhibit the enzyme so that you can have more acetylcholine in the brain. Now, what this does for Alzheimer's disease patients who have less cholinergic neurons is allow them to get more out of the cholinergic neurons that they do have. And this is the most effective way to improve Alzheimer's disease patients' cognition. Now, although cholinergic system is well understood to relate to Alzheimer's disease, it's not so well known that it also relates to depression. So in 1972, a theory was proposed to explain depression. It's called the cholinergic-adrenergic hypothesis of depression. It postulates that an imbalance between the cholinergic neurotransmitter acetylcholine and the adrenergic neurotransmitters epinephrine and norepinephrine is a causal factor in the development of the depressive phenotype in people. Now, it's been overshadowed by the monoamine hypothesis of depression, which is the hypothesis of depression that involves dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, which is the main hypothesis that's used to prescribe antidepressant drugs today. But the cholinergic-adrenergic hypothesis has returned into discussion lately because of some findings that seem to confirm it. However, these findings are a little bit contradictory, and the reason I describe them to you in this video is because I want you to realize how little is really understood firmly about the cholinergic system's relation to our brain or behavioral phenotypes. So let me give you the evidence in line with the theory first. So first of all, acetylcholinesterase inhibition, remember that's the inhibition of that enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, has been shown to produce a depressive phenotype. That means that it seems to indicate that higher levels of acetylcholine in the brain are correlated with depression, which would be in line with that theory. At the same time, the antagonism of nicotinic cholinergic receptors in rodents has been shown to produce an antidepressant phenotype. That means antagonism means blocking the receptors. So blocking the nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which are a set of the receptors as discussed in the previous video, in rodents' brains, meaning blocking the acetylcholine's activity on those receptors, leads to an antidepressant effect. Again, in line with this idea that acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, its activity may be causing a depressive phenotype. A third finding in line with this theory, although less confirmatory on its own, is that most antidepressants prescribed today appear to exert a similar antagonistic effect on cholinergic receptors. Remember, antagonistic again is blocking those receptors, so blocking the effect of acetylcholine. So for example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are SSRIs, like Prozac, what they do is inhibit the transport of serotonin out of the brain, which leads to higher levels of serotonin in the brain. But they also block cholinergic receptors, which could be a reason for the antidepressant effect as well. In fact, it's not just SSRIs. The reuptake inhibitors of dopamine and norepinephrine, and the reuptake inhibitors of epinephrine on its own, and the reuptake inhibitors of in fact, it's not just the SSRIs. The reuptake inhibitors of norepinephrine and dopamine, the reuptake inhibitors of norepinephrine by itself, and the reuptake inhibitors of norepinephrine and serotonin all antagonize cholinergic receptors, blocking the effects of acetylcholine in the brain. In fact, one antidepressant that I frequently get asked about, mirtazapine, which could be characterized as a norepinephrine and serotonin reuptake inhibitor, although it's not completely clear, actually blocks both muscarinic cholinergic receptors and nicotinic cholinergic receptors in the brain. So these three findings seem to indicate that acetylcholine's activity in the brain is producing something like depression, and blocking its activity can produce an antidepressant effect. However, there's also things in neuroscience are never so obvious. There's also some contradictory evidence. So for example, nicotine, which agonizes, meaning stimulates nicotinic cholinergic receptors, all of them, which is a majority of the cholinergic receptors in the brain, produces antidepressant effects through its effect on other neurotransmitters potentially, or through its direct effect on the cholinergic receptors. Additionally, in mice that are called knockout mice, by the way, something important to learn is that a lot of studies these days are done on genetically modified mice. They're called knockout mice. A knockout mice, or KO mouse, is a mouse that has had a gene knocked out of its body to see how the lack of that gene affects the mice's behavior. So in this case, KO mice that have had a single nicotinic cholinergic receptor knocked out, called the alpha 7 receptor, display several things. First of all, they have higher levels of tumor necrosis alpha factor. They have higher levels of interleukin 1 beta, and these two are cytokines that are expressed highly in depressed people, as well as, by the way, people who have severe physical illnesses. They're inflammatory cytokines in the body. So these mice that have had alpha 7, the nicotinic cholinergic receptor, knocked out, display higher levels of these cytokines and a visually depressed phenotype, which indicates that, so number one, nicotine itself produces an antidepressant effect, and not having one of those nicotinic receptors also produces a depressed effect. So this is in complete opposition to the earlier findings that we have. And what does this mean? Well, I have an explanation for it that I've hypothesized myself. First of all, one thing to note is that acetylcholine agonizes all of the cholinergic receptors. That is both the muscarinic cholinergic receptors and the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. It is non-selective. On the other hand, nicotine, which produces an antidepressant effect, unlike acetylcholine, agonizes only the nicotinic receptors. It is selective. So these two findings are not necessarily contradictory. What it may mean is that agonizing some of the receptors may produce an antidepressant effect, whereas agonizing all of them at once may produce a depressive effect. So a second explanation for this is the following. What these scientists have been confused by or puzzled by is that antagonizing these receptors, which means blocking them, seems to produce an antidepressant effect sometimes, whereas agonizing the receptors seems to produce the same effect. And how could that be? Well, this is the interesting thing. Most receptors in our bodies downregulate when they're stimulated. I mean, in the brain, this happens very well-known fashion with dopamine. And this is what causes the chasing the magic dragon of opiate addicts, where, and not just opiate addicts, but most particularly actually cocaine addicts and amphetamine addicts, is that dopamine receptors and most neurotransmitter receptors in the brain do not like to be overstimulated or chronically stimulated. When they are chronically stimulated, they downregulate so that they get stimulated less often to prevent something called excitotoxicity. Excitotoxicity is when receptor is overstimulated and it leads to the neuronal death of the corresponding neuron. Now, if you have too much of the neurotransmitter dopamine, for example through drug use, your dopamine receptors will downregulate. The same will happen for many other neurotransmitters. However, in the case of nicotinic cholinergic receptors in particular, when nicotine is chronically administered, the receptors actually upregulate, the exact opposite of what normally happens. So this means that chronic nicotine use actually upregulates the nicotinic cholinergic receptors. It doesn't upregulate, we're not sure about the muscarinic ones, how those are affected by chronic stimulation. But at the very least, we can say that the nicotinic cholinergic receptors upregulate from nicotine. So this means that this shows an interesting commonality. Nicotine causes an antidepressant effect, but the antagonists of cholinergic receptors also cause an antidepressant effect. Is this contradictory? Not necessarily. Because what happens when you antagonize the receptors, meaning you block them, they also upregulate because they need to sense the neurotransmitter, so they upregulate as well. But in the paradoxical case of nicotinic cholinergic receptors, when they are stimulated, especially by nicotine, they upregulate as well. So the nicotine and the antagonism of the receptors, the blocking of the receptors, both produce the same outcome, an upregulation of the receptors. So it's not actually contradictory. What it means is that the upregulation of the receptors produces an antidepressant effect. This is my theory at the very least. Also, a third note, this is a personal anecdote from personal experience. I firmly believe that higher levels of acetylcholine cause a downregulation of cholinergic neurons, in doing the exact opposite of nicotine. You can try this for yourself. If you consume alpha GPC, which is a form of choline that is a precursor to acetylcholine and easily assembled in the brain into acetylcholine, if you consume it on a daily basis for a couple of weeks, you will find your tolerance will develop, and you will experience less cognitive benefits from the alpha GPC supplementation, which is why avid nootropics people will take days off every week from using the alpha GPC. In a similar way, people who use amphetamines will need to take days off every week to be able to get the same cognitive effects. But this is not true with nicotine. So it shows that the receptors, from personal experience, there's no evidence of this, but I believe that the receptors downregulate from acetylcholine and upregulate from nicotine. I hope you guys enjoyed this description of how the cholinergic system is involved with Alzheimer's disease and depression. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the next installment on this series on the cholinergic system. Be sure to check out the blog post below. Have a great day.